and to welcome her to AEC. Hoda Elsadda is a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. She's an activist for women's rights and a member of the 50 Committee for drafting the 2015 Egyptian Constitution. She previously held a chair in the study of contemporary Arab world at Manchester University, was co-director of the Center for the Advanced Study of the Arab World in the UK, and was president of MUS, the Association of Middle East Women's Studies from 2012 to 2015. In 1992, she co-founded and co-edited Hajar, an interdisciplinary journal in women's studies, published in Arabic. In 1997, she co-founded and is currently chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Women in Memory Forum, a research organization which focuses on reading Arab cultural history from a gender-sensitive perspective. Professor Elsadda is also a board member of many organizations. I'll just name a few. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, JMUS, a member of the board of directors of the Global Fund for Women, a member of the board of trustees of the Sawiris Cultural Award, and a member of the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Professor Elsadda has published extensively in the areas of gender studies, cultural studies, comparative literature, and oral history. Her most recent book is Gender, Nation, and the Arabic Novel, Egypt, 1892-2008, Edinburgh University Press and Syracuse University Press, 2010. The title of the talk today is Creativity, Activism, and Public Memory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hoda Elsadda to our
So good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Iman, for this warm welcome. Amir and I are all friends and colleagues, so I have to divulge the secret. And so it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So I tried to find a topic that is relevant to the Madeleine Lamont Prize, so I hope I will be able to do that. Now, my debate title, actually, and maybe this will give you a sense of what I'm planning to do, is Creativity, Activism, and the Challenges of the Construction and Preservation of Public Memory. So I have three key words here: creativity, activism, and memory. In the midst of all the confusion and uncertainty in these very difficult times, one thing is for certain. The revolutionary wave that has overtaken our region and the world in the past 3 years has unleashed a flood of creativity, imaginative actions, and creative forms of activism. That, I think, we can be certain of. The power of art and creative expression to break taboos, to challenge tenacious stereotypes, to articulate the unsaid and the silence, to defamiliarize. Defamiliarize is a dear word to students of literature, so it's good to remember it. That the art that pushes us to see and face truths and facts that our daily lives and quotidian concerns overshadow or blur. In other words, the power of art to effect social change is a reality that has been tested. Equally important, and this will be my focus, is the power of creative expression to portray, to paint, to describe, record, narrate, to chronicle and document, and hence provide insights when the picture is blurred. The power of art to expose what is hidden or is out of sight, especially at moments of deep divisions, unclear horizons, and conflicting narratives. Why? So narratives of Arab revolutions are typically diverse and conflicting, and they are sites of contestation. Now, all of us ask questions that range from what happened, to who made it happen, to did it happen to begin with. Was the 25th of January 2011 a revolution, a protest movement, a revolution, to use Asif Bayat's words? Was it a soft military coup? Is it ongoing? Has it ended? So do we need to just mourn the end of the revolution? What is the role of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces? What has been the role of the Muslim Brotherhood? What triggered the events? Can we say that the death of Khalid Said was actually a trigger? Did Kifaya, this important movement that started in 2004, trigger? I mean, was the first manifestation of this revolutionary fervor? Was it the workers' strikes that started in 2006? How do we describe the events of the 30th of June 2013? Was it a popular uprising against the rule of the Brotherhood? Was it a military-backed second revolutionary wave? Was it another coup? These are all, questions that still have not received clear-cut answers. The history has not been written yet. And then we also have many questions around very specific events. So again, what happened in Mohammed Mahmoud? What happened in Masbir? What happened in Ba'is al-Muzar? These are all questions I think we're all asking ourselves. Now, these conflicting narratives are engaged in an outright war over the minds and hearts of all concerned, our minds and hearts. Mainly, it's a war over the memory of the period. And I would like to distinguish here between history and memory. Very generally, generalizing, I'm using history to mean official written history, the dominant narrative produced and disseminated by the status quo, authorities, men in power. This is the history written by the victorious. So history is written by the victorious is the famous, these are the famous words of Winston Churchill. Memory, on the other hand, consists of the narratives that have escaped history sometimes, that bring together a much more complex and multi-layered picture of a period and events. So it is the backbone of an alternative narrative or a counter history. Until this minute, I would argue that the official history of the revolution has not been written yet. Thank God for that. So we do not really have what we can describe as the hegemonic narrative that has been established and institutionalized. It hasn't happened yet, actually. It's still a moment of flux. Hence, it's a really important aspect of the current struggle is the struggle over the memory of the period. How do we write, how do we construct the memory of what's happening? In an article entitled In Defense of the Fragment, writing about Hindu-Muslim rights in India today, it's an important article written by Gainendra Pandey. He argued for the importance of fragments in writing the history of sectarian violence in India to counter the nationalist drive to homogenize and normalize by excluding the voices of minorities and marginalized communities. The fragments excluded from official histories, according to Pandey, are the personal accounts and diaries, oral narratives, the poems, the songs, the little stories, the little individual and personal stories. They also, now, if we extend Pandey's list to the 21st century, to us, we can therefore include chants of the revolution, the graffiti, collective writing and composition of songs, the videos now produced, of course, by, let's call them citizen journalists, and that are circulating on the internet. These fragments of history are the building blocks of memory and the source material for a counter-narrative or an alternative history. We are presuming here, of course, because it hasn't been written yet. Now, my initial plan for this talk was to shed light and comment a little bit on a selected number of creative activist expressions and projects that document events and contribute to the shaping of the public memory of these radical transformations we are witnessing in Egypt in particular, in the region in general, and to create a gallery of diverse fragments that supplement or subvert historical accounts, mainstream historical accounts. Now, so ideally, initially, I'm not going to do that, but anyway, initially this was the plan, and so if you think of just here, okay, technology is not always. Maybe you haven't used it for a while. Okay, actually my mistake. So, all right, so, if we're documenting, if we're trying to collect the fragments of memory, we will need to look at graffiti, songs. Yes, I'm sure you, I'm assuming you're all young, this is a young audience, you know more about this than I do, right? So of course this Yasser al-Manawali, his songs can actually be regarded as the chronicle of what's been happening, because each song really captures a moment in the history, especially in the last few years. And then poetry, for example, this poem by Mustafa Ibrahim, again, a very interesting poetic rendering of a very prominent mood. This is one of my favorite projects. I'm sure you all know it. If you don't, you have to. It's the Pipe Project. It's one of these beautiful collaborative projects where you have a workshop consisting of young men and women who sit down and discuss an event, something that has happened, a mood, something important to them, and they sit down and they write songs together, and then they compose them together, and then they sing them in a choir. So again, if you look at the repertoire of the choir project, it's really a chronicle of events of the last 3 years. Beautiful project, I must say. And then, obviously, again, another very famous project here, the Mussolini group, I'm sure you're all familiar. They capture the stories and the events on video, and they circulate them. But then, of course, I must mention my colleague and friend Hoda Elsadda, again, artist. She's a historian, of course, professor of history at AUC a long time ago, but now she has devoted her time to art, and all her exhibitions can constitute actually important documents of documentation of what happened. Short stories written by Mona Prince, again, they tell the story of an experience of what happened. So again, short stories are important. They are very important for understanding the memory, and we must mention this in this show, again, as a chronicle of events. Okay, now I stop here. So these are all, I mean, I would consider all these things important elements if we're trying to tell the story of what happened and to construct the memory of what happened. I'm not going to focus on all of these things because obviously this is not possible, and I will focus on one form of creative activism, which is the personal story. Personal story, the testimony, the eyewitness account. Presented in diverse manifestations, recorded in different forms and media, with the view of creating an archive of voices and images to preserve our collective memory. Now, this was, this decision made for practical reasons, but also based on the fact that I know a little bit about this. And again, what I would like to do in the next 20 minutes is to just explore the intersections, as I said, between the 3 keywords in my title: creativity, activism, and memory. Now first, let me highlight the power of stories and storytelling in the age of technology. One noted element in this outburst of creative activism that we have witnessed over the past 3 years has been the significant increase in documentation projects that record eyewitness accounts using new digital technologies to disseminate written testimonials, photographs obviously, and audio as well as video recordings, collated and disseminated in digital archives made accessible via the web. The 25th of January has been described as, we all know, Revolution 2.0, in reference to the new generation of digital media technology that has allowed ordinary citizens to interact and publish accounts, news items, and their own stories about what happened very easily. So almost instantly we have websites, Facebook pages that were created to gather and collect documents. This is something that happened immediately, even as early as February 2011. Collect documents, photos, statements, videos, and various news items related to the revolutionary wave. Projects documenting oral narratives of activists and their accounts became very popular, as you all know. New technologies have made it possible for ordinary individuals and traditionally marginalized groups to record, edit, and publish their own stories via the new internet platforms that have been made available. Hence, we have a really massive and unprecedented enabling of these voices to reach new publics and to forge new partnerships. Just a reference to this practice of recording and documenting oral stories, in the 70s and 80s, oral historians spearheaded the democratization of historical sources and research by foregrounding the voices of the voiceless and contributing to the creation of oral archives of the marginalized and subaltern groups. Oral history projects occupied center stage in liberation projects. Oral history, the personal story actually, has always been very important for liberation projects and social movements. This is part of history. But now in the 21st century, we have different forms of these oral stories, oral history projects. You have blogs, you have social networking sites, we must take into consideration YouTube, Google, Yahoo, Flickr. These are all venues that encourage individuals to share their stories, be they in text form, in images, audio, or video. In fact, historians right now are taking notice of the rise of video as a medium of expression and communication of oral stories. And one prominent historian regards this development as an opportunity for oral historians who will be required to consider new forms of engagement with the academy and with partners beyond the academy. So there's really a massive transformation in this field. New technologies have also brought about a paradigm shift in debates on orality and literacy, in our relation to the world and to our subjectivity. And new literacy is rapidly growing as new generations master advanced technologies in communication and self-expression. We now talk about the new digital literacy. Now, the literal word is still important, it has not lost its primacy, but the oral and the audiovisual are fast gaining ground as the medium for public debates and public engagement. So actually, and to quote Mr. Kaufman, he said, the literate reader has become a fluent auditor and a capable producer as well, a bard and priest of his own. Everyone now is not only his own historian, but his own oral historian. End of quote. Now, many of these projects either seek out specific target groups with the view of putting across a specific message. Others send out an open invitation to participate with materials and videos. Again, I'm not going to attempt to even go through an exhaustive list because it's very difficult to actually compile, but it is a huge list of really very interesting projects that have again sprung up over the last few years. But I will just go through a few interesting projects that are all about documenting your personal story. So Tahrir on Loan is one of those really interesting projects, started really very early on in February 2011. Storytelling, narrating specific experiences in performances, so theater-like performances. And some of these monologues, you can actually listen to them via the web, all right? So this was one of the very early projects to document the personal story. 18 Days in Tahrir is another interesting project. It's collaborative, but it's also interactive. It invites, the website invites people and makes it very easy for them, giving them instructions to share their stories. All right? So you're invited to share your story, to share your video, to write a text, to do whatever it is that you want, but basically share your story. So it's interactive, and then and everything is collated. Of course, I must mention the AUC University on the Square, again, a project that was initiated by the AUC, and the aim was to preserve, as it actually says on the website, the history of the momentous events through the eyes of the AUC community for future historians. So you're preserving the memory for future historians to be able to write about what's happened. And you have an image gallery, tell your story, and so on and so forth. Another interesting project, I Marched Along, is also a project featuring a series of documentary-style interviews with Egyptian citizens, activists, politicians, public figures, discussing what they think the future holds for women in particular, post-revolution. Finally, this is one of the very interesting projects that documented stories, again, of Egyptian women after the 25th of January revolution, and as the website tells us, it's a web series documenting the participation of women in the French Revolution, in the Egyptian revolution. Also important to note that already existing women's groups, NGOs, have participated in this endeavor, obviously, because it's just collecting the personal story. So this is a reference to Nazra, a feminist group, and they focused on a very specific project, collecting the testimonies of survivors of sexual assaults. So they had a theme, but then they collected a lot of stories. Some of these stories are actually posted on their website, and it's really important to remember that this documentation is not just about history, the future, it's about the present, because actually the stories they documented were extremely important in raising the public awareness about this problem and initiating a very interesting debate at the beginning of 2013. I need to mention Women and Memory Forum. I apologize, I belong to this group, so it's not, but I think I need to mention that, again, Women and Memory is involved in documenting stories, life stories, and also trying to build a digital library that documents what happened in the last few years. All right, so these are all projects that are focusing on the personal story as a very important component of our memory. All right, now, this is all good, but there are many challenges that face these projects, which I would like to talk a little bit about. So we agree that these stories, eyewitness accounts, testimonies are powerful modes of activism. They are, because as I just mentioned, in the case of Nazra, for example, the testimonies that they collected were really very important for initiating and enriching an important public debate about a social and political issue. So they're powerful modes of activism in the struggle over the collective memory of a particular group for the future, but also for the present. As fragments of history, again to use the words of Gandhi, they complement and correct official narratives and potentially construct counter-narratives of dominant histories. So, as I just mentioned, more than ever, marginalized groups, societies, and individuals have more opportunities to reach wider audiences. However, the process of collection, documentation, and ordering these stories, the archiving of these stories, putting them together in some sort of order, is not straightforward, nor is it innocent. And now that we have spoken about all these projects, I'd just like to highlight a couple of issues that need to be taken into consideration. Archive, so whenever you create a website or you initiate a project to document personal stories, what you're doing actually is that you're creating an archive for these stories. And archives are very important for the preservation of memory and for writing history, but they come with their problems. They have been described as tools of the powerful who seek to normalize, standardize, and impose order. In an archive, you have to figure out somehow to order your material. And order here is immediately brings in the whole issue of point of view and the purpose of the archive. So tools of the powerful. In fact, archives in general are regarded as tools of the powerful. Many archivists and librarians will remind us that archives are the manufacturers of memory and not just merely guardians of it. When you actually manufacture memory, you're not just guarding the memory. And they also remind us that power is everyday practice in archives. Now, archives are necessarily entangled in the construction of hegemonic narratives as well as counter-hegemonic narratives. So you can have archives that contest the national narrative, archives that contest a particular story, but then but power is always present in the construction of an archive. Archives mean order, order requires framing consolidates the point of view. And the question immediately becomes, whose point of view gets to control the archive? Who decides what is worth preserving or not? Whose stories are represented? And finally, how do we address the ephemeral nature of the digital archive? So there are three issues. I'll just go through quickly. Whose point of view, the issue of representation, and the ephemeral archive. Now, if we just if we go back to the Mussolini group, So I'll just take the Mussolini group as an example of point of view. Now, this is a group that consists of young citizen journalists. They document events live on camera, publish their videos on YouTube. In a panel discussion at Cairo University in February 2012, there was a panel that hosted the Mussolini group, and they showed video clips which documented violence in particular, perpetrated by state authorities. Now, they said the following: we think of ourselves as a propaganda machine for the revolution. We are not neutral, We give space to people without a voice. So what I'm trying to say is that this group understands that there's no such thing as objective, neutral reporting. And they deliberately have a point of view that they're expressing, and they see this as an attempt to resist, is actually a means of resistance to official media campaigns that discredit protesters and protesters. So it's a group with a point of view, with a vision, with a clear-cut agenda, and they say that we are a propaganda machine for the revolution. So their archive definitely has a particular angle. Now, I come to the second issue, which is the issue of representation. And here, representation has two aspects to it. Who is represented in terms of, so the first thing would be, are women represented properly in archives? Because you have entire groups of people, marginalized groups, women, for example, marginalized in official narratives or in a particular archive. So you have this issue as of representation. And then even if we speak about a specific group, so we have an archive that looks at women in particular, women's voices, how do we choose the women? Are all the women the same? Obviously not. So I'm looking here at a really interesting the project, which is okay. I'm looking at Words of Women. Yes. Okay. So we say that women are usually excluded, but so we discover, so actually if you go through what's been happening in the last 3 years, you will find that there are a number of projects that document the stories of women in particular. So there's a sense that you need to fill the gap. However, if we think of this project, Words of Women from the Egyptian Revolution, it's a consciously feminist project, and also very conscious of issues of representation. So their website talk about, it's an audio-visual her story project to remind history to remind history of the voices of women, and identifies the direction as clearly feminist. The videos show individual women telling their stories to the camera, and these stories are interspersed with relevant real-life scenes of either clashes, protests, something relevant to the story. If you listen to these stories, and they're all very interesting stories, you will notice that you don't hear the interviewer's question, but you gather that the interviewer is asking the women interviewed to reflect on their status as women, their views on gender roles, and women's rights. There are obviously direct questions related to these points. And you have various responses by various interviewees. So we have here, the picture is, no, Nada is not here, sorry. So there's Nada Zatouna, who's a 23-year-old Nubian young woman who talks about discrimination against her as a Nubian, but also discrimination against her as women in society. This is Mariam Pirolos. She's 22-year-old. She's a 22-year-old Coptic woman, and acknowledges that we live in a patriarchal society, and so on. So you have every woman talking about a story, her relation to the revolution, but also reflecting on her situation as a woman. The project is conscious of questions of representation, as I said, because the interviews feature a very diverse group of women, different classes, different age groups, different religions, and different ethnicities. So there's some thinking went into this whole issue of representation. There's no perfect answer to representation, but there was an attempt to address issues of representation. The picture on the left is actually a mother and daughter. So actually it's also a very, very interesting video, one of those really interesting videos, because it's a mother and her daughter, and the conversation is really very, very interesting because it reflects different points of views, how they learn from each other. Really interesting story and insights into the dynamics of what happened actually when people started going out on the street. Okay, so I don't want to go into this. Now these stories told by this group of women, they narrate their own personal experience, but but they also narrate the story of the revolution, if you like. Events are woven in their experiences. So in fact, these stories, these are little short stories, little personal narratives. They're activist stories also because, in a sense, they contribute to political debates, all right? And really important is that they preserve the memory of the little things that get lost in official narratives. The emotions, the reasons why people decided to join this and not that. The little details that usually escape official history. My last point is the challenge of the ephemeral archive. And here it's really about, it's really a question, it's really interesting how things are always a blessing and a curse at the same time. So the ease of establishing digital oral history archives, they come with some disadvantages. First, many small research projects conducted by students at universities, NGOs, individuals, or they create a digital presence that very often, not necessarily, but very often disappears or remains incomplete. This is really one of the striking features of a lot of documentation projects on the web. In fact, digital archives that are floating in virtual space, they do have an ephemeral dimension that needs to be noted. This ephemeralness stands in opposition to the notion of archives as places for the preservation and safeguarding of collective memories. Now, of course, Now, all archives, material, virtual, whatever, are obviously subject to be destroyed. You know, museums have been burned to the ground, so nothing is eternal as such. But there is something a little bit more worrying about digital archives and the fact that they are susceptible to just loss or erasure very, very easily, actually. So we kind of depend on the fact that, I've seen this on the web, but then the following day it has disappeared. And just a browse through cyberspace reveals actually the beginnings and ends of many oral history. So you have a lot of things that have started, that have ceased, they're not active, and so on. And this is a question about some of the things actually that I have just cited. So whereas with technology is a blessing, but also it's a bit dangerous to imagine that it has just resolved, it has solved our problems, and we can just document and it will be there forever. All right. So final word. Our stories, not only shape and guide our lives, but they also constitute the substance of collective memory and of shared history. The collection and archiving of our stories, safeguarding them from loss and oblivion, the challenge of putting them together like pieces of a puzzle in some order to make sense of the world is, I believe, crucial in the struggle over the meaning of the present and the future. Thank you.
I think maybe we have like 5 minutes for questions before we give out the awards. So if anybody has a question for Professor Elsadda.
Do you think there's a necessary lag time? I was thinking about how literature also is, created, and often there's a lag time between, somebody's story immediately and then creating something into a text. Because, could you reverse that, or?
You have a point, and yes, you will find that a lot of writers say that they need time to digest what's happened and to reflect a little bit more. So you're absolutely right. So maybe writing a novel is not something that's going to be as immediate as just an eyewitness account. But what I've been trying to say actually is that these little personal stories that are very immediate perhaps for us, they actually have an autobiography at the end of the day isn't a novel. A lot of reflection has gone into it. When you tell your story, you do follow a plot somehow, right? So to my mind, the distinction between an oral narrative and a novel that has been, that has taken more time, I'm not sure that the boundaries there are so clear-cut. Because when you tell your story, you do have, people tend to have a beginning, middle, and end. people tend to have a story that they want to tell the world. So what you remember, what you forget is really interesting. So I mean, this is now memory studies. So in many, many ways, these little stories are actually short stories that have been well thought out, that have been reflected upon, and but obviously with very, very varying degrees. But so I wouldn't, whereas you're absolutely right, things that have taken more reflection, like sort of like writing a novel after a few years have passed, would be different. But then the boundaries between the immediate and this long-term things not very clear cut.
Yeah. Could you be kind enough to finish the URL for Nazra and Muslimin group? Is it .org, .whatever?
Okay. I don't have it, I don't know it by heart, but if you just put in Google Nazra for family studies.
And the other one, Muslimin group, you put Muslimin only, I don't know.
You just have it. Yes, Google.
No, but Muslimin group or Muslimin only?
If you just say Muslimin, yeah. Google is a fantastic search engine.
One final question here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wonder how you see the connection between, these are in a way kind of informal. So memory is kind of more informal than history, and history is kind of more formal and institutional. How do you see the connection? Like how can these considerations on more representation, more listening to more marginalized voices, how can they be transformed into the formal politics, more into the law, more institutional level?
Yes, I mean, I'm making these very sort of like strict distinctions, but of course it's much more, there are more intersections than I'm suggesting here. But what I'm trying to say is that usually history is the official mainstream hegemonic narrative, all right? That usually is, this is what we usually read in history books, right? So, and what I'm trying to suggest is that this hegemonic narrative has not been written yet. Because we're still in medias res, right? We're still in the middle of things happening. Memory, on the other hand, is this, again, this is a definition, brings together many, many, many more points of views, layers, and so on. So your question is how to make sure that the memory here becomes the official history.
Or our memory.
Or our memory, absolutely. So really it's about making sure that we preserve it. Yeah, so, and my suggestion is that at this time and age, whereas maybe like 200 years ago, it was much more difficult to preserve all these little stories and, you know, and pictures and so on, we do have an opportunity now to actually preserve this while we're conscious. So hopefully we'll be providing, you know, better material, better source materials for future historians to write about this period.
I'm really very sorry. I would have to cut this short that we need to give out the awards, but Dr. Hoda is with us for some time. So if you have any questions, and I know some people here have some questions, so you can come over and discuss it with them. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Hoda. Before we give out the awards, I'd like to thank the Radha Lamont committee members, Professor Gretchen Makaro and Professor Mona Amir, and of course the head of the committee, Professor Amy Watlett, who is on sabbatical and will not be with us today. The winners, and we're going to go by order. Our first place winner is Lara Asim Ahmed. The second place goes to Riham Gamal Abul Waka. And the third place goes to Mr. Bara Al-Haq. I think we have a few moments to hear our winners. So we'll go again by order of the first place. Lara Asim, who will read like 5 minutes from her short story.
Not entirely sure if this is a story or not, but it's short. Next, let's turn this way and that in an attempt to identify the source of the drawn-out monosyllable. Yours would have too if you hadn't caught it. If you hadn't been staring at the man's leathery brown face in a sort of trance, utterly enthralled by the evidence of his daily battle, or dance, depending on how you look at it, with the sun, you would have missed the vibration of his jaw muscle, movement of his lips, the flutter of his eyelids as the word reached its weight with the bodies packed tight against each other in his white home office. Such as the pace of his work that he had to look up at the people whose information is certifying, he spent hardly pausing for breath as it furiously scribbles the same lines of text over and over. The trick is to slide your documents under his oily nose before any of your neighbors gets a chance to. You reel the government together at the back of the crowd and wave at each other when you reach the front. All the while, the man sprawls on, simultaneously answering the questions yelled at him as smoothly as an actor delivering his lines. You push and squeeze and curse, and finally your paperwork is in pride of place, earning the man's full attention, becoming his new magnum opus. You look at his furrowed eyebrows and wonder what he studied in college. Physics, or was he an art major? Did he try his hand at medicine and fail? Could he have capitalized on the presence of prodigious football skills early on and become the Jacob's generation? Or is his story more mundane, with him taking this position temporarily to support his family and ending up too boxed in by the desire for stability? You start thinking about his family, 2 girls maybe and the boy, and the wife who works, perhaps even in another office in this very same building. Is he close to them, or does he find himself unable to convey emotion adequately? Maybe he regrets starting a family, realizing in retrospect that life is a one-person mission. Or maybe he's the type of man who doesn't think about the past, who believes that what's behind him is there for a reason. His freckled hand flies over the last white sheet and then pushes it to the edge of the scratched wooden surface of the desk, reuniting it with its companions, the bulk of which he quickly lean in to secure from the hair of the brown teeth. It is then that he looks up for the first time. His dark brown eyes stare into yours, and you find yourself, to your shame, surprised to find traces of life in them. You thank him, but it's too late. He's already tackling someone else's white sheet, throwing himself into the process with an expert's balance and ease and vigor. Next, he says again, it is almost whispered, so low you feel it's speaking only to you, and though you aren't there, nothing is there, save the papers and words that need to be written on them in his own private world, that which he guards so zealously it has become absolutely impenetrable. But you understand, at least you think you do, and don't those eventually come down to the same thing? After all, even if you could never do work so devastatingly unfulfilling, you're connected to someone who can, and does. You've done your part. You can now go about your life without any qualms. You can take advantage of the opportunities presented to you without feeling that you stole them. You can complain about the habit the universe has of rushing your dreams without enabling afterthought holding you responsible for what it does to other people. And so you exit the room to a welcome draft of fresh air and the air of the stench of sweat and dust and cigarettes, and you take a celebratory breath. Congratulations, you made this.
That was Lara Asim from the Philippines. Thank you very much. Now, Rihan, she will read a part from Magical Refrigerator.
Mine's not as serious. It's about a boy who realizes that he has a magical refrigerator in his kitchen. Fast forward, basically, he realizes that if he touches it, he gets superhuman speed for all of 3 seconds. But then he realizes he has to have the whole refrigerator with it. So it was with a heavy heart that after another half hour of experimentation, I was forced to deduce that unless I carried the whole refrigerator with me, there was no way I could sustain my superhuman speed. I kicked a weighty pile of plastic uselessness and scolded it. Why did it have to be so impractical? Why, of all objects in the house, did the refrigerator have to be the magical object? Who the heck asked for a magical refrigerator anyway? And why, oh why, did I have to have the entire several-ton mass of good-for-nothing metallic piece of garbage with me? What another contradiction. Here you go, Adam, I imagine some cackling deity telling me. Have some superhuman speed. Rule the world. But here's a refrigerator that you have to keep with you at all times. Too bad you couldn't have some superhuman strength to go with that speed, huh? Beside him was probably roaring and laughter. Thor would be brandishing his hammer and gloating. Arthur would tell me to leave the legends to him. Thanks for nothing. I now like to pretend my magical refrigerator does not exist. When I have guests over, I do not reveal to them that I harbor a magical force in my kitchen. I simply open its door, pull out the cooled cans of soda, and slam the door shut, completely ignoring the fading tingling sensation of my fingers. In fact, I have just finished a phone call with the company of the refrigerator, informing them that my refrigerator had malfunctioned and I would like to discuss my 6-year warranty. Sometimes, however, when I'm snuggling in my bed to prepare for sleep, or when I'm pondering the meaning of life in my shower, the same thought catches me off guard. Somewhere, some almighty being in the universe has a terrible sense of humor. A magical refrigerator, what a stupid thing to make.
Last but not least, Bara Al-Hagan, you will read from Sali.
I don't know if the professor got it wrong, but it's a change of plans. It's worded, it's not something.
Oh, okay.
I sent 2 pieces in. By the way, both pieces were pretty good. I'd say they were when I first got the email, I was like, why am I not first or second? I want to be first or second. Anyway. This is worded by Mbro. Sweat rolled like an avalanche down his broad, oblique forehead. It collected on the ledge of his square, jutting brow, and was then absorbed by the dense, swarthy forest of his eyebrows. Slowly, the perspiration dripped down into the large sockets that housed his squinting onyx eyes. From his hollow temples ran a flood of lassitude that made his whole face glisten in the dark emerald light of the walls where he made his abode. His nose was a wide, flat wedge, beaten down by the fists of many a man. From his broad shoulders to the huge stones he called hands, he was a warrior. He had done battle in countless brawls and riots, and he had the scars to show for it. His only reward was his heartbeat. He had survived. This ignoble and relentless behemoth of a man always prevailed and was feared by all mortals with an ounce of sanity. That's why they brought him here. Within these walls, within these prison walls, he reigned. He was truly a giant. He made the rules and he had the power, the strength, and the brawn to enforce them. That is ultimately why they called him Warden.
Thank you, Bara. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you, Professor Hoda Elsadda. And look out for the Madam Lamont next year. Next year is going to be an Arabic inshallah. Thank you all very much.
One last announcement. We have the exhibition of Al-Mudanari Street in the next room. We really invite you to visit and write something.